Let me take a few minutes and go through these two practice questions regarding significance testing and error types. So for question number 1, part A, all you're doing is taking the definition of a p-value and putting it in context. So the p-value of a significance test is the likelihood of a sample statistic as or more extreme than the one observed in the context of the question, under the condition that the null hypothesis is true. So here the p-value of 0.0761 is the probability of observing a difference between the sample proportions as or more extreme than the ones in this study, if in fact the null hypothesis is true. So if in fact there is no difference in the survival rates of the two treatments, the survival rates of the two treatments are equal. In part B, you're being asked to use that p-value to decide what conclusion could be drawn in this study. So literally all you're doing, without doing all of the details of the significance test, you're being asked to write the conclusion. So with this p-value, which is greater than 0.05, we cannot reject the null hypothesis. So in context, we do not have evidence of the alternative. So we don't have evidence to conclude that using CC alone or chest compressions alone produces a higher survival rate than when you're using chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation together. That's all you have to do. So then in part C, your job is to decide what type of error could have been made and what's the consequence. So notice in part B, you did not reject the null hypothesis. So the error type that is possible when you have not rejected but you should, that's a type 2 error. Something to think about, if in part B you actually did reject the null hypothesis, you would not get credit for part B, but you could still get credit for part C, but then you'd be using a different error type. So the correct answer would be you could have committed a type 2 error. So the interpretation would be that if you have not rejected the null hypothesis, you don't believe in evidence of the alternative. You don't believe that CC chest compressions alone produce a higher survival rate. But in reality, they do. So now you're not done. All you've done here is describe the type 2 error. You haven't actually answered the question yet. You have to describe the consequence. And the consequence has to describe what would happen to actual patients. The consequence is that the current practice of chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation together may still be encouraged, when chest compressions alone should be encouraged and might actually save more heart attack patients' lives. So for the second question on the back, once again, part A is about a type 2 error, so you must describe it in context. And again, like the question on the front, you have to be specific in describing what the consequence is. So again, a type 2 error means we have not rejected the null hypothesis when we should have. So we don't believe we have evidence of the alternative, but in fact the alternative is true. So in context, we believe that there's no evidence to suggest the alternative, to suggest that the proportion of adults who can pass the fitness test is less than 35%. But in reality, we should have rejected the null hypothesis because in fact, P really is less than 35%. So in this question, you had to describe the type 2 error in context, and then you also have to describe a consequence. So the consequence in this context is that the rec department won't be able to convince the city council to fund these programs. We're not going to get these fitness programs, so individuals who could have benefited from these programs will not have the chance to participate. So we won't have the opportunity here in order to improve people's physical fitness. In part B, so once again, what you're trying to do, if it was reasonable to conduct a test of significance, so you're being told here, assume that the conditions are met. What would the p-value lead you to conclude? Well, once again, what you are doing, just like the question on the front, you are interpreting the statistical test without having to have actually done all of the calculations or check all of the conditions. So this looks like any other statistical test interpretation. With this gigantic p-value of 0.97, which is greater than 0.05, it's greater than any reasonable level of significance. Again, you can't reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis cannot be rejected. So in the context of the alternative, here's the alternative hypothesis, that P is less than 0.35. So we have no evidence to suggest that the proportion of adults who can pass the fitness test is less than 0.35. So a little review question here, going back to the very beginning of our class, the very first unit. Describe the flaw in this study and explain why it's a concern. So the flaw is pretty straightforward. This study uses volunteers. It even says so right there in part B. So what's the concern? Okay. Well, so you have to describe what makes those volunteers different, and you have to describe the effect that that will have on your estimate of the parameter P. So it may be that these people who are volunteering are already interested in physical fitness, so maybe they're more likely to pass the test in the first place. So we're saying something about why these volunteers are different in terms of physical fitness, in terms of their likelihood to pass the test. But now we have to describe the effect of the estimate of our parameter. So in this case, if the people start off being more physically fit, the sample proportion calculated in the study will overestimate. It's going to be higher than. It will overestimate the true population proportion of adults who could pass the physical fitness test. So pointing out that the study uses volunteers, there's the flaw. But there are still two things left to do. You have to describe why these volunteers are different than the population in general, and you have to describe why that difference will have an effect, and you have to describe the direction of that effect, the direction on the sample proportion in comparison to what the actual population proportion may be. We have overestimated the true population proportion. So I hope you did okay with these questions. I hope you recognize how these are connected over and over again to the same kinds of things we've been studying over the last week or so. These are great review. Hope this has been helpful.